Welcome back for another episode of Carper Blue Fishing, and today we're going to be looking at kayak anchoring, a couple of techniques that I currently use, the reasons why I use them. We're going to look at some of the mistakes that I've made and I've seen other people make, or you might be, well on the way to making yourself. So take the time to watch this video. As I say, it's based on experiences that I've seen others do or I've done myself, and I'm sure there's something in it for everybody. Now, there's a lot of bad advice out there about anchoring, and that's not me being cynical, but I see it time and time again. So what I'm talking about are anchoring methods that you can pretty much use around the majority of the UK coastline. As we've touched on in the first video, it can be quite tidal. In fact, we live in a tidal country where much of our coastline has got quite a pull to it. And if you're new to kayaking, that's you're going to underestimate that, I think. It's fair to say in some of those early trips that I made, I underestimated it too. Despite having spent many years fishing off of a boat and, wrecking and stuff off the channel, when you're on a small craft, it is completely different. And you really, you need your wits about you. You need to be able to do it safely and securely. You need to stay where you anchor. You don't want to be pulling along a chain of rope and causing accidents and things like that. And if I get the opportunity at the end, I'll try and put some methods in about retrieving the anchor and getting all the gear back. Okay, so the anchor trolley. Now this is basically the name given to two pulley wheels that are fitted at the front and usually the rear of the kayak. Now this enables us to reach the anchor when it's behind us, and also to move the position of the anchor as we're retrieving it, or we want to make some kind of adjustment. So we'll have a little look at that. Now, talking about some of the common mistakes that you see with anchor trolleys, probably the biggest one is not getting the pulleys right at the end of the kayak. Now that's quite important because that's going to affect how you sit in the tide. And don't underestimate, if you have this pulley back here and it's on the back of the kayak, you've kind of like got a sort of 15-degree twist in it already, and soon you're swinging around all over the place. So tip one, get these trolley wheels, pulley wheels, right to the ends of the kayak. Here's the pulley wheel mounted on the back of the kayak. Again, I've tried to get that as close as I can to the end. I've had to stop it there just because of my controls for my rudder and stuff like that. But ideally I would have even come right back here if I wasn't worried about chafing cables and stuff like that. Now tip 2 is about the fixings that we use. If you can get access to the inside of the kayak, which I can through the hatches on the front and the rear of mine, I've gone for basically nuts and bolts. So I've got nylock stainless nuts on the back of these with washers. These are obviously hex. I think that's an M5 or M6 bolt. That's secure, that's going to be strong. So if I snag my anchor and I'm putting a lot of pressure on this trying to pull it back, I'm not going to rip a hole in my kayak that you might do if you had something such as a well nut, which you do see kits sold with well nuts. I try and stay away from the well nut kits as a personal recommendation. I have seen those pull out. An alternative that's equally as good as this would be trifold rivets, but you will need a rivet gun. So the anchor trolley itself, as I say, it runs through one of the cords. It's just an oval loop, but one of them runs through perhaps a guide or two just to sit it nicely on the kayak and control it. Okay, I also have a zigzag cleat. It's one way of locking the line to stop it moving. It's handy if you're pulling a snagged anchor. It's also handy, certain strong tides, or if something's shifting in position, or you just want to lock it in a slightly different position, or also for the quick release method, which we'll look at in a while. So you literally just put the trolley line through that and that has locked it solid, which is why I've got a little bit of slack in my line, because I like to lock it up into that. Here's another tip. I use this. So a lot of them have just a oval hoop or a round hoop, which is okay. You can certainly do one method of anchoring with that kind of fixing. So my anchor, I'm lowering over the middle of the kayak, so I can just literally clip it in like that. If I've got a solid hoop, I can't do that operation without, you know, some form of jiggery pokery or different technique. But it's nice and simple. It means that I can quickly break that circuit, break that loop, and attach an anchor. Now, once the anchor is dropped over the side, with my diver's reel on free spool, I'm trolling it to the back of the kayak. So I'm trolling it back here like this. And there it is at the back of the kayak where you can't reach. Okay, so this is fundamentally probably the simplest way of anchoring. And I'm just showing you front to rear. So this I would normally, you know, hang onto the water, just hang over the side like that once it's locked off. If it's banging in the tide, I might stick it inside the kayak. I might just unspool it a little bit like this and then put it back in here behind my seat. Just get it out of my way, wherever I find it's most useful. But you can see I've locked it off. Now, if I'm out at sea, I would have locked this off as we go through, and the back clip, generally like that. So the tide is going to pull the kayak down tide, and then you're going to fish both your rods out the front of the kayak down tide. And this then runs down to the bottom, down to your anchor, to your chain. So without being anchored at the back of the kayak, you know, we can sit funny in the tide, and the tide can push the kayak over, you know, and funny angles and all sorts of things, and just feel rather unstable. So that's why we do that. And of course it enables us to get hold of this later on, but we don't really ever want to be retrieving from the middle of the kayak. So if I'd anchored up like this, I would either just pull myself backwards towards the anchor until it all breaks free, or I would trolley it to the front with this unlocked and back in free spool to pull in. I'll try and show you that on the water. It's probably easier to see than to experience, but the important thing is we don't really want to be pulling from the side, because if that anchor catches in the bottom and it's stuck in something and you've got a fast tide and then all of a sudden it gives, you're pulling this way, so you're pulling towards me, and then it's boom, and you're out that side because it suddenly broke free. So that's why we don't really pull from the side of the kayaks, particularly, you know, in strong tide. There are times you can get away with it, of course. If you've got a gentle tide and you're just in a little bay or whatever, why not fill your boots, but, you know, be careful. So this anchor is a general sort of grapnel anchor, so it's a general good all-round anchor. 1.5 kilos, and that's what I'd recommend. It get you around the majority of the coastline. However, you will see my main setup shortly. This isn't the one that I use the most of the time. Now, important things to consider. I've attached this with a bolt to that end of the anchor, not this end. A lot of people, you know, start anchoring and clip on there and think they're doing themselves a favour. You're not, and we're going to look at the reasons why. Now, the reason why we connect to the back end, and I've used a cable tie. Now, while I'm talking about a cable tie, you see that cable tie is not particularly thick. And that's mistake number 2 that we get with this kind of setup, is people using a cable tie that's too thick for them to break when they're on the water. So we'll have a little test of this in a second. The other thing that I've got is a bit of slack, because if that chain runs tight to that anchor, you're just pulling there. You're not pulling on the cable tie, you're pulling the anchor. You're never going to break that cable tie. And the reason we want this cable tie to break is if this is caught onto something, and we're going to catch it under my foot in a minute, we want to be able to reverse the angle of pull. Now, you can paddle up tide, and you can paddle up tide and pull from this direction, and you're pulling up that way. The problem is when you're up tide and then pulling yourself back, you've got the tide pulling you back down and you're pulling with the tide. You can't really get as much leverage as you sometimes would like. So I'm stuck under a rock For all intents and purposes, it's my foot. So let's imagine my foot is a rock. And I've got that slack in the chain. I'm pulling. I can't get my anchor back. Eventually, I can do that. And it pulls it out from a different angle. Because I'm now pulling from this end. Now that was quite a small cable tie. It's not the one that I use on the water. I use a black one, and I believe it's a 3mm one. But do that little test. You want it to break with, you know, a reasonable amount of force, but you've got to remember, you've got to be able to break that on the water. Now there is something which I did have, which is an anchor link, but I lost that with my last anchor. I don't usually lose a huge amount of anchors, but probably about one every 50, 60 trips I seem to lose one. And I lost that clip on that last one. So you can get a special clip, but there's nothing wrong with a cable tie. Only the environmental impact of every 50 trips or so, you might be leaving 3 inches of plastic in the sea. I do sort of counterbalance that with the amount of litter that I do pick up on every trip. So I don't feel too hard done by, but I do feel a little bit guilty about that. Okay, so I've reset it with my regular cable tie. That's out of my tackle box, not out of the garage. Now what I want to talk to you about is the chain. You see, the chain is there, not really to supply weight. Think of it as a leverage. The chain is going to help pull that nose down, because that is how this becomes an anchor and holds that down. If it's lifted up like that, it isn't going to anchor. If it's held down at the front, you see that it's grabbing my garage. So we kind of want that nose weighed down. That's why we use this chain. Now for that reason, I use a longer length than most. So on this particular setup, I've got about 2.5 meters. Now I'd rather have the advantage of that extra little bit of security, that extra bit of weight, and knowing that I'm not going anywhere. I'd rather carry that extra bit of weight than find myself pulling along the anchor and having to reposition and stuff like that, especially if somebody's down tired of you and you start heading towards them because you've got a big fish on and a ball of weed. So that's why I go for length rather than thickness of chain. You know, I think this is like 5mm thick, something like that. You know, it's not the heaviest chain. People go heavier and shorter, but I don't really understand that. Being a bit of an engineer by trade, I'd rather have a longer length and have that leverage. You know, if you wanted to twist something or lever something up, you'd go longer, and that's why I've gone longer on all my chains. So I alternate between my 2 anchor setups with a stainless carabiner again, and just clip that onto the end of the chain. And this is what they call paracord, I believe. That runs up to a diver's reel. Now I've adapted this, I've just put a bit of a handle on it. Means I can drop it in there if I want to. Or up in here, up in the rod holders. Or just use it as a bit of a leverage on my arm when I'm reeling in. So that was just a little mod that I did there. So to recap, mistakes. Connect to the right end of the anchor, which is the back end. Don't go too strong with the link. Have a little bit of give, a little bit of slack to enable you to pull on that link to break it if you get it stuck. That makes a big difference in your success rate of getting an anchor back over rocky ground. Now that's primarily, I use this anchor where the ground is firmer. So that's like flinty ground, rocky ground, hard bottoms. And this is the anchor I use the majority of the time, which is a 2 kilogram Bruce anchor. Again, it's rigged in the same way, the same 3mm black cable tie, the bit of slack in the end. And this one has got 3 meters of chain. Again, I'd rather personally carry that extra bit of weight. I know I'm staying on my mark and I'm not going to go for a walk halfway through a fishing trip. It's just the only disadvantage with the extra bit of chain is carrying the length. Okay, with an addition of a buoy, we can sort of upgrade our anchor system quite easily to something called a quick release system. That has advantages if you need to move quickly, go and photograph somebody else's fish, or take off following a fish, or you just want to go off and come back in a little while to the same spot. We can release, leaving our anchor out at sea, and come back and clip onto it later. So I've got, again, just a cord and a buoy. Just to look how that cord and that buoy goes. Now this cord I don't just use for the quick release. I keep this on board to anchor to all sorts of things, tie up to crab pots or anything. I've got a couple of them actually. A good thing to have, because as I say, it just adds to your thing. So that runs through, and now I'm attached to my buoy, which is clipped onto my diver's reel, and the whole lot would be floating in the water on the back of the kayak like that, out to your anchoring point. So the advantage with this floating behind you is, I want to move off now. All I'm going to do is flick that and drift away, and that comes out the back of the kayak. My buoy is on the surface, my anchor is where it always was, at the bottom of the seabed, and I'm free to, and when I've come back to my spot and I want to clip back onto my anchor, maybe I've gone off lure fishing for a bit and come back, I literally pick up my line, hook it back over the zigzag cleat, trolley my thing to the back, stop there, and the tide just tightens everything back up, and I'm back to exactly the same spot I was. Unless of course the tide's turned and swung round or something's changed, but you know, fundamentally I can always return to that. I quite like this bottle. I've become attached to this bottle. I like the colour, and I like the fact that it's smaller than the one that I brought when I first started. That's probably the only disadvantage with this kind of setup with the quick release, is you've got to carry more stuff around, and we haven't got a lot of space on kayaks, so you've got to carry a buoy around. Apart from that, it's probably my preferred method to fish, or to anchor. Okay, and this is one of my last anchoring bits. So this is a drogue. It's a cheap drogue, probably made in China like most things these days. I think it's a 30-inch, and this is the one that I use at sea quite a bit, and I've put, as you can see, cable tied a little restrictor in there, which is the top of a cut-off bottle. I do find that not only restricts it, but it also helps it open up and fill up with water when the tide's not flowing that strong. Now it has a float on its cord, and again the clip. You see I use these a lot, and that's one of the main reasons this drogue is why I have a trolley on the other side of the kayak. It's only a half trolley on this side, because I have technology that hangs over the back of the kayak here, transducers and stuff, that means it's a bit of a pain to have the full length one. It was full length before I changed my sounder, but I've shortened it now. So I would drop this out in, normally when there's a wind from the side and it's becoming a bit of a nuisance and the kayak's blowing left and right. So I'll drop this out, and this in the tide will dampen or slow up that swinging around that you get in the thing. That's primarily the reason I would use this particular drogue. And it just holds the kayak straight and nice in line, particularly if I've got a ground bait sack out or something like that. You don't want to be fishing to the left or right of it. You want to be, you know, keeping the kayak over the top of that. And it's just literally clipped on my half trolley. Okay, so there's bound to be some things that I forgot, and I've already thought of a few, so take your time. Yeah, so when you're anchoring, probably something that I still do from time to time now is I rush into it. I think I know where I want to stop, and I start chucking the anchor over the side, and then it all settles down and it isn't quite where you expected it to be. So, you know, stop paddling, see where you drift to, give you an idea of where you're going to lie, and obviously you want to put your anchor upstream of that point by, you know, as I say, sort of 3 times the depth. You can always let a little bit more line out if you go a little bit too far up, can't you? So in terms of being up tide of the mark, you don't want to be up tide of another angler. When you're up tide of another angler and you know you've got to move, by the time you've pulled all your stuff out and you're drifting on the surface, you're on a collision course. Not only that, you're on a collision course if your anchor trips or something else goes a little bit wrong. So, you know, try and spread out, try not to get too close. It's very easy to want to be fishing next to each other, but you know, give each other a little bit of room. So we've had that situation on one of our trips. I've been anchored up, Ian's anchored up a little bit down tide of me. I've hooked into a nice undulate ray, and then I've hooked into a big ball of weed, and it's at Southsea Point and the tide's ripping through, and a ball of weed and an undulate ray and everything's pulling, and it starts dragging the anchor. I can't remember if it actually broke the cable tie or whether it, you know, all this excess resistance was just far too much. But I started trundling down tide towards Ian. Now, there's not much you can do when you're bringing in a fish, a ball of weed. You've got, you know, 80 metres of line out the back, a chain and an anchor. So of course then my chain has picked up his anchor line and then it's running up his. So give each other a bit of space, because, you know, that was a bit sort of scary at the time for him, because, you know, the weight of my kayak and pulling on the back of his, he's all unstable and it's pulling him down a little bit. So he didn't particularly like that. And don't forget, the anchor is also a safety element in its own device. It's one of the first things you want, unless you're going to be paddling and just lure fishing, you know, harbours and bits and pieces. You're going to want an anchor. You're going to want it to rest for the day. You're going to, you know, want it if you're in difficulty, and you're going to drop it down to stop. And above and beyond, we're you know, watching this because we're kayak fishermen or kayak fisherwomen, and we want to catch fish. And it just opens up a whole array of marks and species and stuff like that. So practice your anchoring. Hopefully you've got some of the bits and pieces from my video, found them a little bit useful, understand why I do those. As I say, I'd rather carry a little bit of a heavier anchor, a little bit more chain, and know that I'm going to stay where I want to be, than, you know, trundling off down tide and, you know, having a wasted trip each time. So I think in the next video we're going to be looking at safety equipment on the next video of this series. I mean, I've got some fishing ones that I need to put together, but you know, next weekend I get the opportunity to go around, look at some of the safety equipment, not only on the kayak but what I carry on me personally, with touch base on radios, phones and all sorts of bits and pieces. So yeah, like, subscribe if you want to see something, you know, please leave a comment. I'd you know, like to help if I can. If I can't, you know, I'll say it is. But thanks for watching, and thanks for your support, guys. And